Hey everybody, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to the least ad-friendly series I make on this channel, Shit You Need. It's been a while since I churned one of these out, so I thought it was about time that I shared a few more pieces of gear and or software that has made my life easier, not only in the recent past, but in the pretty much the entire lifetime of this channel for one of our contenders today. And I sometimes trying to do themes with these kind of episodes, sometimes the theme is that there is no theme. For today, this is one of those instances where I can't recommend everything to everybody, but if you are in a specific scenario, if you use gear a certain way, or you already have some collection of equipment, then I would pretty much recommend, without doubt, one of these pieces of gear to you to complement that, and it'll make sense as we get through this. So I'm going to go from least expensive to most expensive again. No freebies today, although I think the software, there is a demo if you would like to try it out before you pull the trigger. But with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's shit show, with the least expensive and perhaps the least recognizable piece of gear on today's list, the Klark Technik Mic Booster CM1. This is a rather unassuming little gray box that's got an XLR input and output, and probably looking at this going, what the hell could this possibly do? It's like just some weird pass-through DI thing. Well, the first thing to note about the Klark Technik brand is apparently this is part of the Behringer supergroup that is pumping out all sorts of different types of musical equipment that costs pennies on the dollar compared to the competition. And this is very much one of those direct competitors to a piece of gear that's on the market and is kind of the standard for this particular problem. It's called the Cloud Lifter, and there's several different variations of that product. But in essence, these are produced to complement large diaphragm dynamic microphones that you might use, like an SM7B, especially when paired with consumer-grade preamplifiers built into audio interfaces like the Focusrite Scarlett series, which I use. If you've got a big rack full of EQs and microphone preamps, this might not be such a problem, but for those of us that are either producing podcasts, or do voiceovers, or vocals at home, you might find that with a microphone like this, you're not getting the kind of levels straight out of the box that you would on like a condenser microphone or a ribbon microphone, because those are often powered by phantom power. So there's a little bit of a boost circuit going on in there regardless. But with this thing, there is a lot of clean gain on tap with most of these audio interfaces nowadays, but there is a couple problems that spawn from having to crank the gain all the way up most of the time to get usable levels. And the first issue usually rears its ugly head while you're trying to directly monitor yourself while tracking vocals or recording your voiceover, and especially, through headphones. Even if you have the level cranked, oftentimes it's trying to compete with, a music mix, and you might not be able to hear yourself well enough. Even if you get that problem figured out, you're likely going to add some latency in doing so if you don't have any other external mixers or anything involved. By the time you get to your audio workstation program, even if you boost the level after the fact, you're likely to hear some noise because of all that boosting you had to do with the audio interface preamp. So what do we do then? Do we have to just shell out, thousands of dollars for a vintage style microphone preamp? Not anymore, you don't. For the longest time, the most straightforward and affordable solution was the Cloud Lifter CL1, a little blue box that looks suspiciously like this, that operates off of phantom power to deliver 20 to, I think it's 25 decibels actually, of clean boost to your microphone, all the while not, at least supposedly, adding any more noise to your signal. Kind of a miracle sounding device, right? Now at $150, when you look at that compared to, a standalone microphone preamp, especially one of the tube variety, it doesn't actually look that bad. And with something that's this compact, you just kind of put it in your microphone cable loop and it's not that big of a deal. But when you start kind of comparing the whole package, if you're using a $250 to $400 audio interface and a microphone that you probably could snag used for around the $300 price point, then spending another $150 on a little box just to amplify your signal, kind of a hard pill to swallow in some ways. And if it was doing something really revolutionary, I've spent more money on stupider things. So that's not the point. But if you look at the circuit of this thing, it's kind of trivial in the grand scheme of things. So I looked at this and said, there's got to be a competitor at this point. And what you know what? Lo and behold, Music Tribe Manufacturing had me covered with the CM1 here. So does it hold up? Does it do what it's supposed to? Is this whole magical no noise floor device all it's cracked up to be? Let's give it a quick whirl, and we'll put that theory to the test. So here we have the SM7B straight into my audio interface. I have the gain up at about 1:30, 2 o'clock. And as you can see, the microphone signal is still extremely tiny. On my monitor, I wasn't pushing anything but like -20, -18 dB at most. And I'm kind of sustaining around the -26, -25 dB region. So this is ridiculously quiet. For context, I don't use any gain in the instrument level when recording guitars. Now, obviously, you take that to line level and it gets quieter, but still, that kind of gives you a reference for just how little signal this thing puts out without some sort of amplifier. So let's go ahead and switch this out with the CM1 in the signal chain. I'll turn on phantom power and we'll hear what happens. So same thing, nothing's changed. I'm not going to put any EQ or compression or limiting. This is simply what it sounds like. And, we're sustaining in the -6 dB region. So that is easily, 20 to 25 dB that they quote. Now, there's a really good review on the Sweetwater comment section that actually tests this with like pink noise and some technical, analysis that I'm not going to get into here. I can refer you to that if you wish to see that. But I think the results kind of speak for themselves. This is not snake oil. It actually does what it says it's supposed to do. And, whatever noise that it does introduce is so minimal that I think the perceived signal to noise ratio is still identical or better in some cases. So it's going to depend on your microphone. It's going to depend on, your entire setup. But I think if you're using a big boy like this one and you have a relatively affordable audio interface, like I think many of us do, this is a no-brainer at the $35 to $40 that it goes for. Check it out. Our next showcase is of the software variety and comes in at about $80 US, though I do recall having bought it cheaper, so perhaps it'll be on sale at some point. And though this may not be as sexy as a guitar pedal or some of the things that we normally show off, I would say if there is one plugin that you spend any money on, any kind of utilitarian thing, this might be the one to do it, because you can get by with standard compressors and EQs, even of the free variety, even if you're trying to model analog gear. There's a lot of decent ones out there. But when it comes to either taking a creative approach to EQ or trying to solve problems in a mix or just with a tone, that simple high pass, low pass, shelves, band type of EQs are not going to be able to solve, this is something to seriously consider. This is Voxengo's CurveEQ, and I've been asked about this software many, many times over the years, and I've not really done a deep dive into it because I personally don't use it to its full potential. I use it for one of the main features that it advertises, which is this static EQ match. So like much of the EQ matching software out there, you can have this listen to a reference file, take what is essentially a static screenshot of that output frequency response, and then apply it to a source tone, and it'll listen and figure out the differences between them and come up with something like either a 10 or 20 or 30 or even 60 point EQ curve to figure out the differences. And for most guitar tones especially, but even with like mastering and mixing scenarios, that is way higher resolution than you would ever find in any graphic EQ or even parametric EQ, and is bordering on like high resolution enough to sound like a guitar cabinet in and of itself. I use this kind of software to make custom impulse responses on top of stuff that I shoot. So, say like my tone engineer videos, if I was trying to sound like Metallica, that's exactly what I did, is I would shoot a cab IR, get it as close as I could, and then, that would be the raw file that you guys could still enjoy. But then I would use CurveEQ to kind of figure out the differences and then make an EQ match, bake that into another IR, and ta-da, you have kind of the album sound all in one. Now, that feature alone, to me, is worth the price of admission with the way I use it. I know there is plenty of competition out there, and some of them are more accurate and do a better job. but some of the other feature sets and workflow just doesn't fit my needs. And this is more than good enough for the way that I use it. But that's not its only trick up its sleeve. And in fact, it's able to do this because of its core architecture. So we're probably used to seeing EQ look something like this. You know, we got a band cut here, a band boost. We can widen or narrow the filter. We can turn on a low shelf or maybe a high pass here to cut some of the lows. We can change this from being a first order, second order, third order filter. You know, these are things that I think most of us are kind of familiar with when it comes to parametric EQ. And this is fine. This is how analog circuits actually do it, because just the way the math works out, these are the filters that happen when you put, you know, resistors and capacitors in different configurations, whether it be, you know, in parallel this way or that way going to ground. That's what happens. However, when especially I was first getting into mixing, I always thought, it's like, why does it have to be this clean? Why does it have to be this shape in the digital world, right? Can't we just make any custom filter we wanted to? And the short answer is yes, that software exists, and CurveEQ fits among that class of software. So if you look at the starting point here, we just have a flat line. This is, you know, no EQ happening, but we can go to any point and start manipulating the curve. And you can see with the way that I'm dragging these points, it creates a curve that does not reflect something that you could even do with real analog circuits, at least without having a million different passes of it. So you can create stuff that's really complicated. You can have things that kind of have a really steep slope in the lower frequency content and then kind of bleeds off here without the need of, you know, daisy chaining a bunch of shelves and low passes together. You can make really, really steep points just to absolutely nuke of, you know, really sharp frequency band, but then keep the rest of it, you know, kind of clean. Really powerful stuff here. Not only that, but you can pretty much do this 3 times within one instance. So you can have what is essentially 3 60-point EQs all attacking different frequency bands running together in one plugin instance. And you can actually see the overall curve change when you do this. So, you know, I'm making this more bright around 2K. Now drag the entire thing down. And when I bring this one up, it does this and does this, and it gets crazy depending on how you want to use this. Not only that, but you can actually draw these in free form. So far I've been using points. Every time I click on the line, it creates a point. But if I go to curve 3, create a freeform curve, I can do this and just do whatever I want. Obviously, you can run into some option paralysis here, but I find this to be so valuable nowadays, especially with what I'm working on currently, as the surgical EQ fix that will solve problems that a simple analog recreation just will not do. I think the mixing and mastering applications here kind of speak for themselves as a result, being able to drill down to extremely narrow frequency bands or be able to do something that isn't even on either side of that frequency, maybe be able to, you know, have a really hard cut on the bass side, but kind of smoothing it out on the treble side, all sorts of interesting things you can do there. But what I've found is that this is a really interesting creative tool for dialing in guitar tones. You know, that's one thing, as I kind of alluded to earlier, that, you know, EQ, compression, the kind of bass sounds don't really excite guitar players too much, even though EQ is a really powerful tool when it comes to dialing in your sounds. But when it comes to playing through a tube amplifier or a cabinet and microphone, I always do try to stick to the mentality that I want to capture as much of the tone and the produced sound all in that one session, right? You want to be able to get your microphone close and have the mix and the phase and everything to where that first take, you don't have to do a whole lot to the sound. And that's great. And that's where something like a more traditional EQ would help in dialing out some of those fizzy frequencies or cutting the boomy lows and the fizzy highs. But with something like CurveEQ, this absolutely rips the lid off of this Pandora's box and turns this into a creative tool set for dialing in new guitar tones. You know, with something like a regular parametric EQ, yes, you can change the overall voicing. You can make it a little brighter here or, you know, scoop out some of the muddy frequencies. But in this instance, you can essentially revoice a mic'd up guitar amp sound in a really convincing way where it still sounds like that mic and cab and that sort of thing, but you can drill down to certain specific frequencies and, you know, take care of those problem areas if you want to, but you can also add frequency content in other areas but not in such big swooping bands that it sounds fake or weird or too smooth. That's one thing I found with some of the impulse responses I shot for the project I'm working on. They sound really good. I'm happy with them. But when you put them in the mix, they kind of sound a little too smooth. And when you look at the overall IR after it's baked into a frequency response curve, you can kind of see that where it kind of does one of these. And yes, there is resolution there, but it's not really exciting. And so I kind of went back over the main guitar bus and added something like this, just this screwed up jagged line, kind of subconsciously going for something, but also just going random and seeing what happens. And it made it really interesting and complex and rich, but it still sounded like that guitar sound. So I'm loving CurveEQ for that, and I wish I had taken advantage of it sooner. Last but certainly not least, we have the THD Hot Plate attenuator, pretty in pink at that, as this is indeed the 8 ohm version. There's, I think, a 2, 4, and a 16. The 8 ohm was getting hard to find, and all of them are a little difficult to find considering that I don't think these have been manufactured in a while. But I went with this particular attenuator because I've been on the hunt for some good ones here recently. having kind of mostly completed my amplifier switch setup, and there will be a sound check video on that at some point. I'm not going to say near future because I'm working on many things, but hopefully sooner rather than later. And the 2 notes torpedo captor that I had does, it did have a attenuator function, but it was fixed at negative 20 dB, and I found that to be way too much for some scenarios, and then not enough in others. But at the same time, the ones that I did want to have that much, output volume cut, it didn't sound right. It didn't interact with the power tubes in the way that I would expect once you start cranking the master volume. It sounded like it was too reactive, like it was scooping too much of the mid contents out and kind of driving the power tubes in a way that made them way too brittle and harsh. So that had to go, and I stumbled upon the rave reviews of the THD Hot Plate. I've seen these around forever, but it was always my understanding that these were mostly a resistive load with some reactive and capacitive elements in there. But I took a swing at it, and boy, am I glad I did, because I think this should be considered one of the gold standards of amplifier attenuation. It does exactly what it's supposed to do and nothing else. I've heard good things about some of the other models out there, but again, for my setup, I don't need an additional load box. I have one, although this does have load capability, which is really cool. But I already had that built in, so this is, the accuracy of the load on its own is not a concern for me. I don't need anything else with impulse responses. I don't need all that junk. I just want something that has an in and an out, and I can put in the loop of my attenuator loop on the speaker and amp selector that I have. To make the cut as my one and only attenuator going forward, the prospective contenders would have to perform 2 tasks absolutely flawlessly, and I was not willing to budge on those whatsoever. Fortunately, at least one of them you can tell just from the product picture, but not everybody's got the second one figured out, as it turns out, and I was willing to go through a number of these and flip them until I was satisfied. Fortunately, I got it right on the money on the first try. So the first feature that is a big improvement over some of the stuff I've had in the past, even though this is an older attenuator, is the number of attenuation modes, which ranges from 0 to 4, 8, 12, and 16 decibels of cut. That alone is already a much higher level of resolution than I dealt with in the past, and I feel like the 4 decibel steps feels right. Every time I want to crank the master volume a little higher, but maintain the same sort of in the room level, I could pretty much find one of these settings that's going to work really well for me. Now, if you want to get really loud, the 16 dB setting actually brings you over to this switch, to where you can dial back even further to basically negative infinity, which is great. So if you're trying to saturate the power section of a Sun amplifier or an SLO, then you might be interested in something like negative 20, negative 24, maybe even negative 30 dB of attenuation, and that is all at your fingertips here, which is great. I would have been happy enough with those features alone, but it keeps on giving with the deep and the bright switch. So this is so transparent, as one of the features that I was very much not willing to budge on, that I don't feel that these are necessary at all. When you switch from negative 4 to negative 8, even down to negative 16, you don't hear a tonal difference. Your amp just gets quieter, and that's what you want. Any of the difference that you hear is because of the overall volume, the Fletcher-Munson curve, and the speakers not being driven as hard and probably not compressing. And that's exactly what I wanted, right? I don't want the amp to react any differently. I just want it to be quieter. That way you can crank the volume and get those power tubes working when you want them to. But there's probably going to be scenarios out there, whether because of the Fletcher-Munson curve or because the amp and cab and speaker combinations just reacting a little differently, where you might want to make up some of that low and high end. Maybe your rig sounding a little boxy once you start cutting in the negative 8 to negative 12 dB region, and that's where you have the deep and bright switches. So this is kind of like having 2 fixed positions of a depth and presence circuit on here, to where you add some feedback into the lower and higher resonant frequencies that the power amp's being driven off of from the speaker resonance, and you kind of get a hi-fi effect, right? You get a low boost, a high boost, and I think this can sound really, really great for more contemporary tones, even on top of what you might already have on your amplifier. So it's a nice tonal sculpting tool if you need it. I feel like the more vintage-inspired crowd probably wouldn't need these as much as non-master volume amps, and those that rely on higher master volume settings, kind of sound good in that mid-focus, more lo-fi territory. So, but, either way, they're there, and that's always great. The cherry on top or cherries as it were, is the noise reduction circuit, which you can actually see light up every time you play, the louder you get. So I don't know, there's some sort of, you know, phosphorescent tube or what's going on here. But there is some sort of gating action going on. No, you don't have an ISP decimator built into here, but doing something with a light emitting component that is you know, helping with background hiss and hum, and it works great. I've never had any issues out of it. And again, I'm not 100% sure what component is in there that's actually doing that, but it works, so no complaints from me. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, there is a load setting on here, so beyond the -16 to how many ever dBs of cut you have, you can basically use this and no speaker if you absolutely wanted to. Now, I've not tried to measure the quality of this or shoot it out with my reactive load because I'm not using it that way. If you want to see those results, I could probably, you know, figure that out pretty quickly. But it's there, and I think that's a really great thing to have in case you don't. I'm really picky about the speaker reactivity curve, so I want to stick with my for that application. But otherwise, this is a kick-ass attenuator. I'm very sad they don't make them anymore, but if you are one that has one or several tube amplifiers that you need to get loud, or more often than not, you want to crank everything up loud, but the wife won't let you, and the neighbors will get pissed if you do. So at that point, an attenuator is non-optional, and I think the THD Hot Plate is a fantastic choice. It's a shame they're not being, you know, sold brand new anymore. You can still find them, you know, on Reverb and eBay and stuff, but they are getting more rare. So that's why I would say if you're interested in all, grab one of these. They're fantastic. There's other good stuff out there, but if you're like me, you just want a no-nonsense, hot pink kind of device, at least if you're using an 8-ohm speaker jack, then this is good to go. Yeah, maybe you can get a few additional girls at the show by showing up in you know, a Steel Panther outfit with your hot pink attenuator on top of your plexi stack. And that shall conclude today's installment of Shit You Need. It is chilly outside, but it is hot as hell under these lights, so I'm ready to wrap this up. Again, thank you as always for watching and sticking to the end. If you have any questions about this stuff, do let me know down below. I will try to answer. If I don't know, I'll try to point you to someone that does know. And we will see you next time. Probably more modeling content. It's what you guys requested in the poll. And then thereafter, we'll probably get on to some regular tube amplifier stuff. Thanks again. We'll see you next time. Bye.